Chapter 1. Tea and tragedy. The afternoon light streamed through the lace curtains of Gossington Hall, casting delicate patterns across the polished mahogany table where Mrs. Dolly Bantry had arranged her finest bone china. The annual St. Mary Mead Garden Club charity tea was, as always, perfectly timed to coincide with the first full bloom of the summer roses, and the sweet fragrance wafted through the open French doors, mingling with the scent of freshly baked scones and strawberry jam. "Do you think we should have put Lady Westfield next to Mrs. Prothero?" Mrs. Bantry fretted, adjusting a place card with her plump fingers. "Only I've heard that there was some unpleasantness between them at the Church Restoration Committee last month." Miss Jane Marple, a tall, thin woman with snow-white hair and the deceptively benign countenance of everyone's favourite aunt, smiled gently as she arranged a vase of pink roses. "I believe that would be most unwise, dear," she said. "I remember when my poor maid Martha's niece had that unfortunate misunderstanding with the butcher's boy. It's remarkable how these small grievances can fester if given the opportunity." Mrs. Bantry immediately adjusted her seating plan. Over the years, she had learned to heed Miss Marple's subtle warnings, however obliquely they might be delivered. "There," she said with satisfaction. "Lady Westfield beside Colonel Bantry, and Mrs. Prothero next to Mr. Llewellyn. That should keep everyone civil, at least through the cucumber sandwiches." The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 3, and precisely on cue the first guests began to arrive. St. Mary Mead prided itself on punctuality almost as much as it valued its gossip. Colonel Bantry, a ruddy-faced man with a military bearing, greeted each arrival with hearty handshakes or polite bows. He had been persuaded to don his best suit for the occasion, though he had drawn the line at wearing a flower in his buttonhole, insisting that such fripperies were not for a man who had commanded troops in the Punjab. By 3:30, the drawing-room of Gossington Hall hummed with the gentle murmur of polite conversation. Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner, her bright blue eyes taking in every detail of the assembled company. There was Lady Westfield, recently returned from London, and making rather a show of her new hat with its peacock feathers. Beside her, Dr. Haydock conversed amiably, his weathered face crinkling with laughter at something she had said. The doctor had been tending to the ailments of St. Mary Mead for over 30 years, and knew more secrets than most, though he guarded them with professional discretion. Across the room stood the vicar, Reverend Leonard Clement, and his much younger wife Griselda, who was deep in conversation with Jane Hellier, the beautiful but famously dim-witted actress who had recently purchased the old Mabley Cottage. Mrs. Prothero, the magistrate's wife, was studiously avoiding looking in Lady Westfield's direction, while her husband, the stern Colonel Prothero, seemed to be lecturing young Lawrence Redding on some matter of village governance. But it was the newcomer who caught Miss Marple's attention most keenly. Miss Eleanor Vane, a slender woman of perhaps 35, with striking auburn hair and a face that, while not conventionally beautiful, possessed a certain magnetic quality. She had arrived in St. Mary Mead only a fortnight ago, taking up residence in River Cottage, and little was known about her, except that she had apparently inherited the property from a distant relative. As Miss Marple watched, Eleanor Vane touched the silver locket at her throat, a gesture she had noticed the woman repeat several times already. There was something nervous in the motion, something that suggested the locket held more than a mere keepsake. "More tea, Miss Marple?" offered Mrs. Bantry, interrupting her observations. "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple replied, holding out her cup. As Mrs. Bantry poured, she added, "Miss Vane seems to be settling in well. Has she mentioned any family connections in the area?" Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice to a discreet murmur. "Very little. She claims to be a distant cousin of old Mrs. Carmichael, who owned River Cottage. But Mrs. Price Ridley says she's never heard the name Vane mentioned in connection with the Carmichaels, and she's kept track of every birth, marriage and christening in the county for the past 40 years. "How very interesting," said Miss Marple mildly. The peaceful atmosphere of the garden party was suddenly disrupted by the arrival of a young woman who burst through the French doors, her face pale with distress. It was Jenny, the Bantry's parlour-maid. "Colonel Sir Bantry, Dr. Haydock!" she cried. "Please come quickly. It's Mr. Llewellyn. I think he's dead." A shocked hush fell over the gathering. Dr. Haydock immediately rose to his feet, medical bag already in hand, while Colonel Bantry strode quickly toward the distraught maid. "Where is he, girl? Calm yourself and speak clearly," he commanded. "In the rose garden, sir," Jenny stammered, "by the stone bench under the arbour. I was taking a short cut to the kitchen, and I saw him just lying there, and his face is all—" She broke off with a sob. As Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry hurried outside, followed by several of the more curious guests, Miss Marple remained seated, though her knitting needles had momentarily stilled. Her gaze drifted to Eleanor Vane, who had gone quite pale, her fingers clutching the silver locket so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "Dear me," murmured Miss Marple to herself, "how very unfortunate." Within minutes the tranquil garden party had dissolved into chaos. Dr. Haydock confirmed what Jenny had already suspected. Cedric Llewellyn, the wealthy retired solicitor who had moved to St. Mary Mead only 6 months prior, was indeed dead, and not from natural causes. The ugly bruising around his neck told a different story. Inspector Slack from the county police was summoned, and the guests were firmly requested to remain at Gossington Hall until statements could be taken. As darkness began to fall, and the last of the summer light faded from the sky, Miss Marple observed Eleanor Vane slipping away from the main group to stand alone by the window. In the reflection of the glass, Miss Marple could see tears streaming down the woman's face. But was it grief or fear that caused them? And all the while, the silver locket gleamed at Eleanor Vane's throat, catching the lamplight like a warning signal, or perhaps a clue to the darkness that had descended upon St. Mary Mead on what should have been a most pleasant summer afternoon. Chapter 2. Whispers and Suspicions. By morning, news of Cedric Llewellyn's murder had spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. The village post office buzzed with speculation as residents queued for stamps and parcels, each offering their own theory on the previous day's tragedy. "It must have been a robbery gone wrong," insisted Mrs. Price Ridley, adjusting her spectacles imperiously. Mr. Llewellyn was known to carry substantial sums, very careless, in my opinion. "Nonsense," countered Miss Weatherby, the retired schoolmistress. "This was clearly the work of a vagrant. I've been saying for months that those people camping near Farmer Mitchell's south field would bring trouble." Miss Marple said nothing as she carefully selected a ball of pale blue wool, but her eyes missed nothing. She had risen early that morning to tend to her garden, particularly the sweet peas that required such delicate attention at this time of year. The gardening had given her ample opportunity to observe Inspector Slack and his constables combing the rose garden at Gossington Hall, visible just beyond her garden wall. "What do you think, Miss Marple?" asked the postmistress, Mrs. Blade, always eager to draw the elderly lady into conversation. "You were there when it happened, weren't you?" "Oh dear, yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Most distressing. Poor Mr. Llewellyn seemed in perfectly good spirits at the start of the tea. He was particularly admiring of the Bantry's new rose varieties, Golden Jubilee, I believe they're called. Such a vibrant yellow. Reminds me of the ones my nephew Raymond sent me from Surrey last spring." The other ladies exchanged glances. Miss Marple's habit of drawing parallels to seemingly unrelated village incidents was well known, if not always appreciated. "Well, I heard," Mrs. Blade lowered her voice conspiratorially, "that Inspector Slack has been questioning that newcomer, Miss Vane, most thoroughly. Apparently, she and Mr. Llewellyn knew each other before, though she denied it when she first came to the village." This piece of information caused Miss Marple's fingers to pause momentarily in their selection of wool. "Indeed? How very interesting!" As she left the post office, Miss Marple nearly collided with Dr. Haydock, who was hurrying down the high street with his medical bag. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "I trust you weren't too disturbed by yesterday's dreadful business." "Good morning, Doctor. One can never be prepared for such things, can one? I wonder, has the time of death been established?" Dr. Haydock hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, according to the police surgeon. Strangulation, as you might have guessed. Quite deliberate, I'm afraid. Inspector Slack is rather keen to speak with everyone who was at Gossington Hall yesterday." "Sure he is," Miss Marple nodded. "Such a thorough man, Inspector Slack, though sometimes he reminds me of my grandnephew's terrier. So eager to chase the most obvious rabbit that he misses the fox entirely." Dr. Haydock chuckled. "I wouldn't say that to his face, Miss Marple. He's convinced himself that Miss Vane is somehow involved. The fact that Llewellyn's pocket watch and wallet were untouched rules out robbery, and Miss Vane was notably absent from the party for nearly 20 minutes before the body was discovered." Was she indeed? Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened with interest. I hadn't noticed her absence myself, but then I was helping Mrs. Bantry arrange the second round of refreshments. As they parted ways, Miss Marple decided to take a slight detour on her way home. The narrow lane that led past River Cottage would add only a few minutes to her walk, and the morning was particularly fine for early summer. River Cottage stood a little apart from the other village houses, nestled near the bend of the stream that gave it its name. As Miss Marple approached, she observed a slim figure kneeling among the wildflowers at the edge of the garden. Eleanor Vane, without her customary poise. Her hair was dishevelled, and she wasn't wearing the silver locket that had seemed so precious to her the previous day. "Good morning, Miss Vane," called Miss Marple cheerfully. "What beautiful forget-me-nots! They do so love that damp soil near the water." Eleanor Vane startled violently, her hand flying to her throat where the locket would normally rest. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." I'm taking advantage of the morning sunshine for a little walk," Miss Marple explained. "One mustn't waste these beautiful days, especially after such unpleasantness as yesterday." "No, indeed," murmured Eleanor, her eyes darting nervously toward the cottage door. "Excuse me if I don't invite you in for tea. I'm afraid the cottage is in disarray, and I have an appointment shortly." "Of course, dear. Another time, perhaps." Miss Marple smiled benignly, but her sharp eyes had already noted the curtain twitching at the cottage window, suggesting that Eleanor Vane was not alone. As Miss Marple continued her walk home, she pondered this curious detail, along with the missing silver locket and Eleanor's evident distress. By the time she reached her gate, she had mentally compared Eleanor Vane to no fewer than 3 previous acquaintances whose behaviour had concealed significant secrets. Most notably, young Dora Bunner from the village of Much Benham, whose nervous habits had eventually revealed a connection to a stolen diamond bracelet some 15 years ago. Miss Marple was just preparing her mid-morning tea when a sharp knock came at her door. Opening it, she found herself face to face with the formidable figure of Inspector Slack. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said briskly. "I need to ask you a few questions about yesterday's events at Gossington Hall, and I understand you were quite familiar with the deceased." Miss Marple blinked in surprise. "Mr. Llewellyn? Why, I had only met him 6 times since he moved to the village. What gave you the impression we were acquainted?" Inspector Slack's expression hardened. "Because, Miss Marple, we found your name and address written on a piece of paper in his coat pocket, along with the words urgent and danger underlined twice." Chapter 3. A Paper Trail Miss. Marple poured tea for Inspector Slack with steady hands that belied her inner surprise. The policeman sat uncomfortably in her floral armchair, his notebook open on his knee, regarding her with barely concealed suspicion. "I assure you, Inspector, I have no idea why Mr. Llewellyn would have written my name in such a context," she said, passing him a cup of Darjeeling. "Though I did notice something rather peculiar about his manner at the garden party." "And what might that be?" Slack asked, his pencil poised. He seemed quite agitated when Miss Vane arrived, not visibly to most people perhaps, but I observed him spill a drop of tea on his waistcoat, something a man as fastidious as Mr. Llewellyn would normally never do. The inspector's eyes narrowed. "So, you did know him well enough to judge his character?" "One doesn't need lengthy acquaintance to recognize certain traits, Inspector. Mr. Llewellyn reminded me very much of my late cousin Harold, meticulous to a fault. Harold once spent an entire afternoon retracing his steps through the village to find a shirt button." Slack sighed heavily, clearly finding Miss Marple's reminiscences irrelevant. "The note also mentioned a locket. Does that mean anything to you?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "How very curious. Miss Vane wears, or rather wore, a silver locket. She was touching it constantly during the tea party, but when I saw her this morning, it was gone." This information finally captured the inspector's full attention. He leaned forward. "You saw Miss Vane this morning? Where?" "I passed by River Cottage during my morning walk. Miss Vane seemed quite distressed, and I believe she had a visitor, though she did not invite me in." After Inspector Slack departed with this information, Miss Marple sat quietly, contemplating the curious connection between herself, Mr. Llewellyn, and the silver locket. After some consideration, she placed a telephone call to her dear friend, Mrs. Bantry. "Dolly, I wonder if you might remember something. Did Mr. Llewellyn ever mention his professional life in London? I seem to recall him saying something about a particular case at one of your dinner parties." Mrs. Bantry's voice crackled over the line. "Oh, yes, he was terribly proud of his career, always dropping hints about famous clients without actually naming them. Most frustrating. But he did mention once that he specialized in wills and inheritances for several prominent families." "Inheritances," murmured Miss Marple. "How very interesting." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage for her weekly meeting with the Altar Guild. As she arranged flowers with Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, she delicately broached the subject of Cedric Llewellyn. "Such a dreadful business," sighed Griselda Clement. "Leonard is quite upset. Mr. Llewellyn had made an appointment to see him yesterday evening, presumably after the garden party." "Did he say why?" asked Miss Marple casually, trimming a stem. "Something about church records, I believe. He was interested in the parish archives, particularly the older baptismal registers." Miss Marple's fingers stilled momentarily before continuing their work. "How unusual! Did he mention which period he was researching?" "I think Leonard said it was from the 1890s. "Oh, and there was something else." Griselda frowned, trying to remember. "Yes, he asked specifically about the Carmichael family, the previous owners of River Cottage. The mention of Eleanor Vane's supposed relatives caught Miss Marple's attention immediately, but she merely nodded and placed another lily in the arrangement. As she left the vicarage, she noticed Lawrence Redding, the handsome young painter who had recently taken the old studio near the church, in earnest conversation with Eleanor Vane beside the churchyard wall. Their heads were close together, and the discussion appeared intense. When they spotted Miss Marple, they quickly separated, Eleanor hurrying away while Lawrence approached with an overly bright smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Beautiful day for flower arranging." "Indeed, Mr. Redding," she replied placidly, "though perhaps not ideal for outdoor painting. I noticed your easel set up by the river yesterday afternoon, quite near the time poor Mr. Llewellyn must have met his end." Lawrence's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, terrible business, though I'm afraid I didn't see anything useful. I was focused on capturing the light on the water. You know how quickly it changes." "Oh, yes," agreed Miss Marple. "Things can change in an instant, can't they? Much like people's circumstances." That evening, as dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Haydock arrived just as she was lighting her reading lamp, his expression grave. "I thought you should know, Miss Marple, that Inspector Slack has taken Miss Vane to the police station for formal questioning. It seems they've discovered that Cedric Llewellyn was executor of a substantial trust that Eleanor Vane was set to inherit, provided she could prove her identity as Catherine Carmichael's granddaughter." "And the proof required was?" Miss Marple asked, though she already suspected the answer. "A family heirloom, a silver locket containing a portrait miniature of Catherine Carmichael as a young woman. According to the terms of the trust, the inheritance could only be claimed by a direct descendant who possessed this locket." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And I suppose the locket has not been found among Miss Vane's possessions?" "No," confirmed Dr. Haydock, though the inspector did find something else of interest. A telegram sent to Llewellyn the morning of the murder. It simply read, "Have discovered the truth about Evie. Will provide evidence today. J.M." Miss Marple's eyes widened in genuine surprise. "J.M. My initials. Precisely why I came to warn you, Jane. Inspector Slack is convinced you know more than you're saying. And there's something else. They found traces of soil from the rose garden on Lawrence Redding's shoes, despite his claim that he spent all afternoon at the riverbank." As Dr. Haydock took his leave, Miss Marple sat very still in her chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, but it was still incomplete. Who had sent that telegram using her initials? And where was the silver locket that seemed to be at the heart of this mystery? Her contemplation was interrupted by a soft tapping at her back door, a sound so faint that at first she thought she had imagined it. Rising cautiously, she moved to the kitchen and called out, "Who's there?" Chapter 4. An Unexpected Visitor. "Who's there?" Miss Marple called again, her hand hovering near the telephone should she need to summon help. "Please," came a whispered reply. "It's Jenny from Gossington Hall. I need to speak with you, Miss Marple. I'm frightened." Miss Marple unlocked the door to admit the parlour-maid who had discovered Cedric Llewellyn's body. The young woman was shivering despite the mild evening, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Come in, dear, and sit by the fire," Miss Marple said kindly, guiding the distraught girl to the sitting-room. "I'll make you some hot, sweet tea. That's what you need for shock." When she returned with the tea tray, Jenny had composed herself somewhat, though her hands still trembled as she accepted the cup. "Now then," said Miss Marple gently, "what's troubling you?" "It's about Mr. Llewellyn," Jenny began hesitantly. I didn't tell the police everything. I was scared, you see. But now Miss Vane's been taken away, and I can't bear to think that an innocent person might be blamed." Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened with interest, though her expression remained kindly. "Whatever you know, dear, it would be best to tell Inspector Slack." "I can't," Jenny exclaimed. "Not yet. That's why I came to you. Everyone says you understand these things. That you helped solve that terrible business at Gossington Hall before." "What didn't you tell the police, Jenny?" Miss Marple asked directly. The maid took a shaky breath. "When I found Mr. Llewellyn, there was someone else in the garden, running away through the side gate. I only caught a glimpse, but it was definitely a man." "And you recognize this person?" Jenny nodded miserably. "It was Mr. Lawrence Redding. And that's not all. I found something else near where Mr. Llewellyn was lying." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a crumpled handkerchief, carefully unfolding it to reveal a small, tarnished key. "I didn't know what it was for, but I was frightened and picked it up without thinking. Then I heard about the missing locket, and I wondered." Miss Marple examined the key without touching it. This could indeed be a key to a piece of jewellery, though whether it belongs to Miss Vane's locket, I couldn't say. "But Jenny, you must tell Inspector Slack about this." "I will, I promise. But there's more. Earlier that day, before the party, I overheard Mr. Llewellyn arguing with someone in the library when I was bringing in fresh flowers. It was Lady Westfield, and she was furious about something to do with her late husband's affairs. She said, 'You promised that matter was settled permanently,' and he replied, 'Nothing is permanent when new evidence comes to light.'" Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. Lady Westfield had been one of Cedric Llewellyn's clients. That much was common knowledge in the village. But what matter had supposedly been settled? After Jenny departed, with a firm promise to speak to Inspector Slack first thing in the morning, Miss Marple sat by her dying fire, mentally reviewing everything she knew about Cedric Llewellyn's final day. Her contemplation was interrupted by the telephone's shrill ring. It was Mrs. Bantry, sounding breathless with excitement. "Jane, the most extraordinary thing has happened. Colonel Prothero just telephoned Arthur in a state. Apparently, Inspector Slack searched Lawrence Redding's studio this evening and found the missing silver locket hidden in a paint box." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple, recalling Lawrence's intense conversation with Eleanor Vane by the churchyard. "How very interesting." "But that's not all," continued Mrs. Bantry eagerly. "When they opened it, the locket contained no portrait miniature, just a scrap of paper with a series of numbers written on it. Lawrence Redding has been arrested, of course, but he claims the locket was planted in his studio." After concluding the call, Miss Marple spent a restless night. By morning, she had reached a decision. After breakfast, she put on her best hat and walked briskly to the police station, where a surprised desk sergeant showed her into Inspector Slack's office. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with poorly concealed impatience, "I'm rather busy with the Llewellyn case." "That's precisely why I've come, Inspector," she replied calmly. "I believe I may have some information about those numbers found in the locket." Slack's eyebrows shot up. "How could you possibly know about that? We haven't released that detail." "St. Mary Mead has always been an excellent conductor of information, Inspector," she said with a small smile. "The numbers, I suspect they might be a reference to church parish records. Mr. Llewellyn had arranged to examine the baptismal registers from the 1890s, specifically regarding the Carmichael family. The inspector's expression shifted from scepticism to grudging interest. "Go on." "I believe those numbers may indicate specific pages or entries that would prove whether Miss Vane is truly Catherine Carmichael's granddaughter, or an impostor." Inspector Slack leaned back in his chair. "We've already sent a constable to check the church records. The pages corresponding to those numbers have been torn out. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" "Most convenient for someone," agreed Miss Marple. "There's something else you should know. The maid Jenny came to see me last night." After explaining about Jenny's sighting of Lawrence Redding and the mysterious key, Miss Marple added, "I also think you should speak with Lady Westfield about her conversation with Mr. Llewellyn on the day of his death." As Miss Marple left the police station, she noticed Eleanor Vane being escorted out by a female officer, apparently released from questioning. The woman's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but there was something defiant in her posture. As their paths crossed, Eleanor whispered urgently, "Please help me prove the truth, Miss Marple. I am who I claim to be." Before Miss Marple could respond, Eleanor was guided into a waiting taxi. Watching it drive away, Miss Marple made a sudden decision and changed direction, heading toward the one place where answers might lie hidden, River Cottage itself. Chapter 5. Secrets at River Cottage. River Cottage stood serenely in the morning light, its weathered stone walls and climbing roses giving no hint of the secrets it might harbour. Miss Marple paused at the garden gate, ostensibly to admire a particularly fine stand of delphiniums, but in reality to observe the cottage carefully. With Eleanor Vane absent and Lawrence Redding in police custody, the building appeared deserted. Yet something caught her eye. A slight movement at an upstairs window, quickly stilled. Someone was inside, watching. Miss Marple straightened her hat decisively, and made her way up the garden path. Before she could knock, the door swung open to reveal the tall, aristocratic figure of Lady Westfield. "I saw you from the window," Lady Westfield said coolly. "I suppose you've come prying, like everyone else." Miss Marple met her gaze calmly. "Good morning, Lady Westfield. I was hoping to speak with Miss Vane, but I see she hasn't returned." "Eleanor is still dealing with the police, thanks to that insufferable Inspector Slack," Lady Westfield replied with a dismissive wave. "I'm simply collecting some of her things. She'll be staying with me until this ghastly business is resolved." "How kind of you," murmured Miss Marple. "I wasn't aware you and Miss Vane were so well acquainted." A flicker of something, caution perhaps, crossed Lady Westfield's face. "We've become friends since her arrival in the village. Naturally, I want to help during this difficult time." "Naturally," echoed Miss Marple. "I understand you were one of Mr. Llewellyn's clients." Lady Westfield's expression hardened. "Who told you that?" "Well, it's hardly a secret, I suppose. Yes, Cedric handled some matters for my late husband's estate. Rather incompetently, I might add." "I believe you spoke with him the day he died," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but persistent. "Did I? I speak with so many people. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to." Lady Westfield made to close the door, but Miss Marple, with surprising quickness for her age, placed her foot in the gap. "Before I go, might I use your bathroom? I've walked quite a distance this morning." After a moment's hesitation, Lady Westfield reluctantly stepped aside. "Upstairs, first door on the right." As Miss Marple climbed the narrow staircase, she noted the cottage's curious blend of old and new, antique furniture mixed with modern conveniences that seemed at odds with Eleanor Vane's supposed circumstances. The bathroom was indeed where Lady Westfield had indicated, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a partially open door further along the corridor. With a quick glance to ensure Lady Westfield remained downstairs, she slipped into what appeared to be a small study. A writing desk stood against one wall, its surface covered with papers that had been hastily gathered into an untidy pile. Beside it, a wastebasket contained torn fragments of what looked like photographs. Miss Marple's swift, practised fingers rescued several pieces before she heard Lady Westfield's impatient voice calling from below. Concealing the fragments in her handbag, she quickly used the bathroom as promised and descended. "Thank you," she said pleasantly. "Such a charming cottage. The Carmichaels kept it beautifully for so many years, didn't they? I remember visiting old Miss Catherine when I was quite young." Lady Westfield's response was cut short by the unexpected arrival of Griselda Clement, the vicar's wife, who appeared breathlessly at the open door. "Oh, Miss Marple, Lady Westfield, I'm so glad to find you both. Leonard sent me immediately. Something terrible has happened at the church." Within minutes, the three women were hurrying towards St. Mary Mead Church, where a small crowd had already gathered. The Reverend Clement met them at the lych gate, his normally placid face drawn with concern. "The parish chest has been broken into," he explained, leading them inside. The older registers, including the ones Mr. Llewellyn was interested in, have been vandalized further. Not just the missing pages now, but someone has actually defaced entire sections with ink. In the vestry, the ancient parish chest stood with its lid splintered open. Inspector Slack was already there, photographing the damaged books with grim efficiency. "Deliberately targeted," he muttered, nodding curtly to the newcomers. Someone was determined to destroy specific information. Miss Marple bent to examine one of the stained pages, where dark ink obscured baptismal records from January 1894. "Such a shame," she said softly. "These are irreplaceable historical documents." "More than that," said the inspector sharply. "They're evidence, and someone knew exactly what we were looking for." As the group exited the church, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Dr. Haydock, who had arrived to view the scene at Inspector Slack's request. "First murder, now vandalism," the doctor remarked. "St. Mary Mead is becoming positively criminal." "Yes," agreed Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Though I wonder if we're looking at these events in the correct order." Dr. Haydock raised an eyebrow. "You think the registers were tampered with before Llewellyn's death?" "It would make sense, wouldn't it? If someone discovered that Mr. Llewellyn intended to examine them closely." As they reached the village green, Miss Marple bid the doctor goodbye and continued homeward, her mind working methodically through the morning's discoveries. In the privacy of her cottage, she carefully extracted the torn photograph fragments from her handbag and began to piece them together on her dining table. Gradually, an image emerged, a faded sepia photograph of two young women in Edwardian dress, standing before what appeared to be River Cottage in its earlier days. Both wore identical silver lockets around their necks. One of the women was unmistakably the young Catherine Carmichael, whose portrait hung in the village hall. The other's face had been deliberately torn away. Miss Marple was so absorbed in her discovery that she barely registered the knock at her door. When she opened it, she found herself face to face with Inspector Slack and a uniformed constable, Miss Jane Marple. The inspector said formally, "I need you to accompany me to the station to answer some questions about these." He held up an evidence bag containing several crumpled sheets of paper, notes written in an elegant hand that Miss Marple recognized immediately as her own. They were the pages from her personal notebook, containing her private observations about the case, pages she was certain had been locked safely in her desk drawer that morning. Chapter 6. Questions and Revelations. The interview room at the police station was sparse and functional, with a distinct chill that Miss Marple suspected was not entirely due to poor heating. Inspector Slack sat across from her, her notebook pages spread before him. "Would you care to explain these, Miss Marple?" he asked, tapping the papers with one finger. "They appear to be my personal notes, Inspector," she replied calmly. "Though I'm rather curious to know how they came into your possession." "They were handed in anonymously," Slack said, watching her reaction carefully. "What interests me is how accurately they detail aspects of the investigation that haven't been made public." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "When one has lived in a village as long as I have, Inspector, one develops an eye for patterns. People in St. Mary Mead are rather like people everywhere. They behave in certain ways when they have something to hide." "And according to your notes, you believe several people have plenty to hide," Slack observed, scanning the pages. "You've drawn some rather specific conclusions about Miss Vane's identity. Merely observations, Inspector. For instance, Eleanor Vane claims to be Catherine Carmichael's granddaughter, yet seems unfamiliar with many details about River Cottage that a family member would know. That's hardly proof of anything. No, agreed Miss Marple, but it is interesting that Mr. Llewellyn, who was tasked with verifying her claim to the Carmichael inheritance, arranged to examine parish records shortly before his death. Inspector Slack leaned forward. There's something else here, a reference to identical lockets. What exactly have you discovered, Miss Marple? After a moment's hesitation, Miss Marple reached into her handbag and produced the pieced-together photograph she had taken from River Cottage. 2 young women, Inspector, both wearing silver lockets identical to the one Miss Vane was wearing at the garden party. One is certainly Catherine Carmichael. The other's identity has been deliberately obscured. The inspector studied the photograph with sudden interest. Where did you get this? From River Cottage this morning. Lady Westfield was there, supposedly collecting Miss Vane's things. This information clearly surprised Slack. Lady Westfield had no business entering that property. We hadn't finished our search. Indeed, murmured Miss Marple. Most improper. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Sergeant Melchett entered, looking uncomfortable. Sorry to interrupt, sir, but there's been another development. Miss Eleanor Vane has disappeared from Lady Westfield's home, and Lawrence Redding has escaped custody during transfer to the county jail. Inspector Slack rose abruptly. When was Redding last seen? About an hour ago, sir. And there's something else. Dr. Haydock just telephoned. He says he's found something important in Llewellyn's medical records that you should see immediately. Slack turned to Miss Marple with barely concealed frustration. I'll need to continue this interview later. You're free to go for now, but don't leave the village. I wouldn't dream of it, Inspector, Miss Marple assured him. Emerging from the police station into the afternoon sunshine, Miss Marple found herself unexpectedly face to face with Colonel Prothero, the local magistrate, whose stern expression softened slightly at the sight of her. Miss Marple, I trust Slack wasn't giving you too difficult a time. Not at all, Colonel. Just routine questions. The Colonel harumphed dismissively. Slack's a good officer, but lacks imagination, always focusing on the obvious suspect rather than looking deeper. He lowered his voice. Between ourselves, I never believed young Redding capable of murder, despite his indiscretions. Oh? Miss Marple's interest was piqued. What sort of indiscretions? Colonel Prothero looked uncomfortable. Nothing criminal, you understand. But I saw him several times in earnest conversation with Lady Westfield in the weeks before Llewellyn's death. Most recently at the Blue Boar, looking over some papers together, quite secretive about it too. This connection between Lawrence Redding and Lady Westfield was new information, and Miss Marple filed it away carefully as she bade the Colonel goodbye. Instead of returning home, she made her way to Dr. Haydock's surgery, timing her arrival to coincide with the end of his afternoon consultations. The doctor seemed unsurprised to see her. I wondered when you'd appear, Jane, he said, ushering her into his office. I suppose you've heard I found something in Llewellyn's records, Inspector. Slack was called away before he could elaborate, she replied. Dr. Haydock nodded, retrieving a file from his desk. Cedric Llewellyn consulted me 3 weeks ago about persistent headaches and vision disturbances. I suspected possible early signs of a vascular condition and recommended tests. The results came back the day before his death." He paused significantly. "The man was dying, Jane. 6 months at most." "I see," said Miss Marple quietly. "Did he know?" "I informed him that morning. He took it calmly, said it simply meant he needed to put certain affairs in order more quickly than anticipated." The doctor hesitated. "There's something else. Among his personal effects was a sealed letter addressed to you, which I was instructed to deliver in the event of his death. I only discovered it today when reviewing his file." He handed her an envelope, slightly yellowed with age, addressed in faded ink. "To be delivered to Miss Jane Marple in the event of my death or disappearance. Cedric Llewellyn." Miss Marple stared at it in surprise. "This wasn't written recently." "No," agreed Dr. Haydock. "I'd say that ink is at least 20 years old." As Miss Marple left the surgery, letter in hand, she noticed a familiar figure hurrying down the high street. Jenny, the Bantry's parlour-maid. The girl looked frightened, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Making a swift decision, Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance. Jenny turned down Church Lane and disappeared through the lych gate into the churchyard. When Miss Marple reached the gate moments later, she was startled by a sudden movement among the ancient yew trees, a flash of auburn hair that could only belong to Eleanor Vane. The 2 young women were meeting secretly in the churchyard, and from the intensity of their whispered conversation, it was clear that whatever they were discussing was of grave importance. Chapter 7. Whispers Among the Graves. Miss Marple moved quietly behind the shelter of an ancient yew tree, careful to remain out of sight. The wind carried fragments of the hushed conversation between Eleanor Vane and Jenny to her ears. "You're certain it was in the locket?" Eleanor was asking anxiously. "The key had to be there." "I told you, miss, it wasn't," Jenny replied, wringing her hands. "Just that paper with numbers. And now they're saying Mr. Redding's escaped and—" "Lawrence knows what he's doing," Eleanor interrupted. "Did you check the place I told you?" "Behind the loose brick in the garden wall." "Yes, but there was nothing there either." Eleanor's face crumpled in despair. "Then we've lost everything. Without the key and the portrait." Their conversation halted abruptly as the church door opened and the Reverend Clement emerged. The 2 young women quickly separated, Jenny hurrying out through the lych gate, while Eleanor ducked behind a large tombstone. Miss Marple waited until the vicar had returned inside before approaching Eleanor's hiding place. "I believe it's time. We had a proper conversation, Miss Vane," she said calmly. Eleanor gasped in surprise, her hand instinctively going to her throat where the locket had once been. "Miss Marple, how long have you been—" "Long enough," Miss Marple replied, settling herself on a nearby stone bench. "You mentioned a key and a portrait. I presume you mean the key that Jenny found near Mr. Llewellyn's body, and a portrait that should have been inside your silver locket?" Eleanor hesitated, then sat beside Miss Marple with a defeated sigh. "Yes, the portrait miniature of Catherine Carmichael is the final proof of my identity. Without it, I can't claim my inheritance." "And the key? It unlocks a small compartment behind the portrait, containing a letter from Catherine confirming that I am her granddaughter. Mr. Llewellyn kept the key separate from the locket for safekeeping." "Yet you were wearing the locket at the garden," party," Miss Marple observed. "If Mr. Llewellyn hadn't yet verified your claim—" "He gave it to me that morning," Eleanor explained. "Said he'd finally satisfied himself of my identity and was ready to complete the legal proceedings. But then someone attacked him, stole the locket, and later planted it in Lawrence's studio without the portrait or letter." Miss Marple regarded the young woman thoughtfully. "Why did you run away from Lady Westfield's home?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "Because I overheard her on the telephone, arranging to meet someone at River Cottage tonight. She said, 'Once I have the portrait, we can proceed with the final stage.' I couldn't risk staying there. And your relationship with Lawrence Redding?" "He was helping me," Eleanor said simply. "Lawrence grew up in St. Mary Mead. His grandmother was Catherine Carmichael's companion for many years. He knows the history of River Cottage better than anyone." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew the pieced-together photograph. "This may interest you. I found it at River Cottage this morning." Eleanor stared at the image, her eyes widening. "Where did you get this? I've been searching everywhere for it. That's Catherine on the right, and the other woman is her sister, Margaret. They were twins." "Twins?" Miss Marple repeated with interest. "Both wearing identical lockets?" "Family heirlooms from their mother. There were only ever two made." Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "Margaret disappeared in 1898 under mysterious circumstances. The family never spoke of her again. It was as if she'd never existed." Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Lawrence Redding emerged from behind a row of gravestones, looking dishevelled but determined. "Eleanor, we need to leave immediately. They're searching the village for both of us." He stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple. "I'm not what the police think, Miss Marple. I didn't kill Llewellyn." "I don't believe you did," Miss Marple replied, surprising them both. "But running makes you appear guilty. What exactly is your connection to Lady Westfield?" Lawrence exchanged a glance with Eleanor before responding. "She hired me initially to paint her portrait. But then she learned of my family's connection to River Cottage and began asking questions about the Carmichael inheritance. Lawrence discovered that Lady Westfield has been investigating the Carmichael family for months," Eleanor added. "She even tried to bribe him to help discredit my claim." Miss Marple nodded slowly, pieces beginning to fall into place. "And Mr. Llewellyn? Did he know about Lady Westfield's interest?" "He suspected something," Lawrence confirmed. "The day before the murder, he told me he'd uncovered evidence that would expose a decades-old deception and asked me to meet him at the garden party." The sudden wail of a police siren in the distance brought their conversation to an abrupt halt. Lawrence took Eleanor's hand urgently. "We need to go." "Wait," said Miss Marple, remembering the letter from Dr. Haydock. "I have something that might help us understand what's happening." She broke the seal on the yellowed envelope and extracted a single sheet of paper covered in Cedric Llewellyn's precise handwriting. As she read the contents, her expression changed from curiosity to shock. "Oh dear," she murmured, "this is far worse than I imagined." "What does it say?" Eleanor asked anxiously. "It appears that Mr. Llewellyn has been expecting trouble for many years," Miss Marple replied, folding the letter carefully. "He writes that if anything suspicious happens to him, I should examine the family Bible at River Cottage, specifically the inscription on the flyleaf." "The family Bible?" Eleanor frowned. "I've never seen it." "According to this letter, it's hidden in what he calls the priest's hole, a secret compartment behind the fireplace in the main bedroom." Lawrence's face lit with recognition. "I know where that is. My grandmother showed me once when I was a child. It was used to hide Catholic priests during the persecution under Queen Elizabeth V. The police siren grew louder, clearly approaching the church. Lawrence looked at Miss Marple imploringly. "Will you help us? We need to find that Bible before Lady Westfield does." Miss Marple rose decisively. "There's a rear path through the churchyard that leads to the river. Follow it to Gossington Hall and ask for Colonel Bantry. Tell him I sent you. Meanwhile, I believe it's time I paid another visit to River Cottage." Chapter 8. Revelations at River Cottage. Dusk was falling as Miss Marple approached River Cottage for the second time that day. She had taken a circuitous route to avoid encountering Inspector Slack or his constables, who were undoubtedly searching for Eleanor Vane and Lawrence Redding throughout the village. The cottage appeared deserted, its windows dark against the deepening twilight. Miss Marple paused by the garden gate, surveying the property with careful attention. A faint light flickered briefly at an upstairs window, so brief that anyone less observant might have missed it entirely. Someone was inside, moving cautiously with minimal illumination. Miss Marple considered her options. Confronting an intruder directly would be foolhardy, yet the family Bible that Cedric Llewellyn had mentioned might hold the key to the entire mystery. After a moment's deliberation, she slipped around to the back of the cottage, where an old kitchen garden offered more secluded access. The back door yielded surprisingly easily to her gentle push, not locked, but not precisely open either, as if someone had recently entered without properly securing it afterward. Miss Marple stepped silently into the kitchen, grateful for the rubber-soled gardening shoes she had chosen for comfort rather than fashion. From upstairs came the muffled sounds of movement, someone shifting furniture, opening drawers. Miss Marple navigated carefully through the darkened ground floor, avoiding the creaking floorboard near the fireplace that she had noted during her earlier visit. The main bedroom occupied the largest space on the upper floor, its door now standing, ajar with soft lamplight spilling into the corridor. Miss Marple approached cautiously, peering through the gap. Lady Westfield stood before the fireplace, methodically removing books from the adjacent shelves and stacking them on the floor. Her elegant hands, incongruous against the dusty volumes, worked with urgency as she muttered under her breath. "It must be here somewhere. The old fool said it was behind the fireplace." Miss Marple watched as Lady Westfield ran her fingers along the ornate woodwork of the mantelpiece, pressing and prodding in search of a mechanism. Suddenly, with a soft click, a section of the panelling beside the fireplace swung inward, revealing a narrow cavity, the priest's hole that Lawrence had mentioned. Lady Westfield exclaimed in triumph, reaching deep into the dark space. When her hand emerged, it held a large leather-bound volume, unmistakably a family Bible, its covers worn with age and handling. "At last," she breathed, carrying the Bible to the bed where she opened it with reverent care. Her attention focused immediately on the flyleaf, where generations of Carmichaels had recorded births, marriages, and deaths. Miss Marple chose this moment to step into the doorway. "Good evening, Lady Westfield," she said calmly. I see you've found what Mr. Llewellyn thought so important." Lady Westfield started violently, nearly dropping the Bible. "Miss Marple, what on earth are you doing here?" "Much the same as you, I imagine, seeking answers." Miss Marple moved further into the room, her eyes fixed on the open Bible. "May I see what you've discovered?" For a moment, Lady Westfield looked as though she might refuse, but something in Miss Marple's steady gaze seemed to deflate her resistance. "It makes no difference now," she said, turning the Bible so that Miss Marple could read the faded ink of the family records. Miss Marple studied the entries carefully, her attention drawn to a particular section. Margaret Eliza Carmichael, born 12th May 1872. Catherine Anne Carmichael, born 12th May 1872. Beneath these entries, in a different hand and clearly added later, was written Margaret Eliza Carmichael, died 17th of September 1898. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was a nearly invisible notation beside this entry, in faded pencil: "Not deceased, banished to America, C.A.C." "Catherine knew her sister wasn't dead," Miss Marple murmured. "She made a private note of the truth." "Yes," agreed Lady Westfield, her voice suddenly weary. "Margaret Carmichael didn't die in 1898. She was sent to America in disgrace after bearing an illegitimate child, a daughter." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "And that daughter was—" "My mother," Lady Westfield replied, closing the Bible gently. "Margaret was my grandmother. When she died in New York in 1942, she left me her silver locket and the truth about my heritage. For years I did nothing with this knowledge, until I learned that Catherine had died without direct heirs and left everything to her closest living relative." "So you came to England to claim the inheritance," Miss Marple concluded, "only to discover that someone else, Eleanor Vane, had made the same claim." "That girl is an impostor," Lady Westfield said bitterly. "She appeared with a suspiciously convenient story, and a silver locket identical to mine. Llewellyn was actually considering her claim." "And so you confronted him at the garden party," Miss Marple suggested quietly. Lady Westfield's face paled. "I did speak with him, yes. He told me he'd found proof in the parish records that would settle the matter once and for all. But I didn't kill him, Miss Marple." "Yet you searched his body afterwards, looking for the key to the locket," Miss Marple continued inexorably. "The key that would reveal the letter confirming Eleanor's identity." "I never touched his body," Lady Westfield protested. I was searching for Eleanor's locket, yes, to prove it was a fake. But someone had already taken it." Their conversation was interrupted by a sound from downstairs, the unmistakable closing of the front door. Lady Westfield's eyes widened in alarm. "The police?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, moving towards the bedroom door. "Or perhaps someone else with an interest in the Carmichael inheritance." Before either woman could react further, a figure appeared in the doorway. Lawrence Redding, his face grave as he took in the scene before him. "Miss Marple," he acknowledged with a nod. "I came as quickly as I could. Eleanor has been arrested, Inspector. Slack found us at Gossington Hall." His gaze shifted to Lady Westfield, and the Bible she still clutched. "I see you've discovered the family records." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "They tell a fascinating story of twin sisters and secret banishment, but they don't reveal who killed Cedric Llewellyn. Lawrence stepped further into the room, his expression hardening as he looked at Lady Westfield. I think I might know the answer to that. You see, I found something at my studio that the police missed during their search. Something that explains everything. Chapter 9. The Missing Piece. What exactly did you find, Mr. Redding? Miss Marple asked, her attention fixed on the young painter. Lawrence reached into his pocket and produced a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. Carefully unfolding the fabric, he revealed a miniature portrait, a delicate painting of a young woman with auburn hair and familiar features. The portrait from the Locket, Lady Westfield breathed, reaching for it instinctively. Lawrence held it back. Not quite. This is the portrait from Eleanor's locket, yes, but look closely at the reverse side. He turned the miniature over to reveal spidery handwriting on the backing paper. My dearest granddaughter Eleanor, bearer of this portrait and heir to River Cottage. May it guide you home. Catherine Carmichael, 1951. This proves that Eleanor is genuine, Lawrence said firmly. I found it hidden in my paint supplies, placed there by whoever planted the empty locket in my studio. Lady Westfield sank onto the edge of the bed, her face ashen. Impossible! Catherine had no grandchildren. Margaret was her only sibling, and I am Margaret's only grandchild. Not quite, came a new voice from the doorway. Miss Marple turned to find Jenny, the Bantry's parlour-maid, standing there. Gone was the timid demeanour of a domestic servant, replaced by a quiet dignity that transformed her bearing completely. My name is Jennifer Carmichael, she said, stepping into the room. Margaret, Carmichael had 2 daughters in America, not one. Your mother, Lady Westfield, and mine. We are cousins. The revelation hung in the air for a moment, before Lady Westfield found her voice. Preposterous! I never heard of any sister. Your mother was the elder by 7 years, Jenny replied calmly. Mine was sent to a different family when Margaret fell ill and couldn't care for both children. They lost touch. My mother returned to England after the war, found Catherine Carmichael, and was recognized as her great-niece. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And Catherine, having no children of her own, formed a bond with your mother, and later with you. Yes, Jenny confirmed. I grew up visiting River Cottage. When I was 18, Catherine gave me a silver locket, identical to the one Margaret had taken to America, the one Lady Westfield now possesses. Inside was this portrait and a letter confirming my inheritance. Then who is Eleanor Vane? Lady Westfield demanded. A sad smile crossed Jenny's face. Eleanor is my cousin, your niece, Lady Westfield. Her mother was your younger sister, who died when Eleanor was a child. I have no sister, Lady Westfield insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. You did, said Lawrence quietly. Eleanor told me the whole story. Your mother never revealed the truth to you, but she had another daughter who she gave up for adoption. That daughter, Eleanor's mother, traced her birth family and discovered her connection to the Carmichaels. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly through this tangled family history. So both Eleanor and Jenny have legitimate claims as Catherine's great-great-nieces, while Lady Westfield is her great-niece. 3 women, all with Carmichael blood, all with potential claims to the inheritance. and all with motives to kill Cedric Llewellyn if he threatened those claims," Inspector Slack concluded, appearing suddenly in the doorway with Constable Wells behind him. The room fell silent as the inspector surveyed the gathered suspects. "We've been watching this cottage since Miss Marple's visit this morning," he explained, nodding to Miss Marple. "Most educational, listening to your family revelations. But now I need to know which of you killed Llewellyn." "None of us," Jenny said firmly. "Mr. Llewellyn was helping me establish my claim when Eleanor appeared with her locket. He was determined to verify both our stories before making his final recommendation to the trustees." "And you, Lady Westfield?" Slack turned to her. "You arrived in St. Mary Mead 3 months ago, shortly after Catherine Carmichael's death was announced in the newspapers." Lady Westfield lifted her chin defiantly. "I came to claim what was rightfully mine. When I learned Llewellyn was considering other claimants, I confronted him, yes, but I didn't kill him." "Yet you were seen arguing with him the morning of his death," Slack pressed. "About my claim, nothing more. He told me he'd found evidence that would resolve everything. I assumed he meant evidence against these alleged relatives." Lawrence stepped forward. "Inspector, I think I know what evidence Llewellyn discovered." He gestured to the Bible still open on the bed. "Look at the final entry on the family record." Miss Marple peered at the page and found, in Catherine Carmichael's distinctive handwriting, an entry dated just 2 months before her death. "Having no children of my own, I hereby recognize Jennifer Margaret Carmichael as my rightful heir and beneficiary. The silver locket she wears is proof of her identity and my wishes." Below this, a second entry had been partially erased, but remained faintly visible. "Should Eleanor Vane present herself with the second locket, she too shall share equally." "Someone attempted to erase the provision for Eleanor," Miss Marple observed, "and I suspect Mr. Llewellyn discovered this tampering." "But who would have access to this Bible?" Slack asked. "It was hidden in a secret compartment. Someone who knew River Cottage intimately," Miss Marple answered, her eyes moving thoughtfully around the room. "Someone who needed to ensure that only one claim to the inheritance would be recognized." A sound from the doorway drew their attention, the unmistakable click of a revolver being cocked. Colonel Prothero stood there, the weapon held steadily in his hand. "I'm afraid that's quite enough," he said coldly. "I've let this charade continue long enough. None of you will be leaving this room with that Bible or the portrait." Miss Marple regarded him with sudden understanding. "Of course," she murmured. "You were Catherine Carmichael's solicitor before Cedric Llewellyn. You knew about the priest's hole and about the provisions of her will." "Catherine was a foolish, sentimental old woman," Prothero growled, "determined to divide her estate among distant relatives she barely knew. I spent 30 years advising her finances, only to be replaced by that upstart Llewellyn, who started asking far too many questions about the trust I'd established." Chapter 10. The Colonel's Confession. A tense silence filled the bedroom of River Cottage as Colonel Prothero kept his revolver trained on the gathered group. Inspector Slack had instinctively moved to shield Miss Marple, while Lawrence Redding stood protectively near Jenny. Lady Westfield remained seated on the bed, her aristocratic composure momentarily shattered by this unexpected development. "Colonel Prothero," Inspector Slack said evenly, "put down the weapon. You're only making things worse for yourself." The Colonel's laugh was harsh. "Worse. I've spent decades building my reputation in this village. I was the executor of half the estates in the county until that meddling Llewellyn arrived and started reviewing my cases." "You embezzled from the Carmichael Trust," Miss Marple said quietly, her keen eyes studying the Colonel's face. "That's why you were so opposed to any legitimate heir coming forward." Prothero's expression hardened. The old woman had more money than she knew what to do with. She wouldn't miss what I borrowed for investments. I intended to replace it eventually. "But then Catherine Carmichael died," Miss Marple continued, "and you realized her heir would review the accounts. So you altered the family Bible to remove Eleanor's claim, hoping to control matters through a single heir that you could perhaps influence." Jenny's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "That's why you offered me the position at Gossington Hall last year, to keep me close and monitor my activities." "A simple precaution," Prothero admitted. Everything was proceeding smoothly until Eleanor Vane appeared with her locket. Monsieur Marple nodded thoughtfully, and Mr. Llewellyn complicated matters further by insisting on verifying both claims. When he discovered the erasure in the Bible, he realized someone had tampered with Catherine's wishes. That's why he arranged to check the parish records, to confirm the Carmichael family connections independently. "The fool wouldn't let it rest," Prothero growled. "When I learned he'd made an appointment to examine the church registers, I had no choice but to remove the relevant pages." "And when that wasn't enough, you killed him," Inspector Slack concluded grimly. The Colonel's grip on the revolver tightened. "It was regrettable, but necessary. Llewellyn told me that morning he'd found irrefutable evidence of financial impropriety, and intended to present it to the trustees. He'd already written to Miss Marple, suspecting something was amiss. But why write to me?" Miss Marple wondered aloud. "We were hardly close acquaintances." "Because of your reputation, my dear," Prothero said with grudging respect. "Even 20 years ago, Llewellyn knew of your uncanny ability to see through deception. He once told me you were the only person in St. Mary Mead he would trust with a sensitive matter." Miss Marple recalled the date on the letter, written long before the current events had unfolded, as if Llewellyn had anticipated trouble even then. "You followed him to the garden party," she prompted. "I needed to ensure his silence," Prothero admitted. "When I saw him alone in the rose garden, I approached him one last time. He refused to cooperate, threatening to expose everything: the missing funds, the altered Bible entry, the suppressed claims. He even had the audacity to suggest I turn myself in." A bitter smile twisted his features. His back was turned. It was simply a matter of seizing the opportunity. "And the locket?" Lawrence asked, his voice tight with anger. "You took it from his body?" "Llewellyn had retrieved it from his office that morning to return to Eleanor," Prothero explained. Afterward, I searched his pockets and found it. I knew it contained proof of Eleanor's claim, so I needed to discredit both her and the locket." His gaze shifted to Lawrence. "Your studio was the perfect place to hide it, especially after Jenny mentioned seeing you near the garden that afternoon. Jenny gasped. "I never said that." "Not to me," Prothero agreed, "but to Mrs. Bantry, who innocently repeated it at dinner that evening. A fortunate coincidence. There's one thing I don't understand." Inspector Slack interjected. "The key that Jenny found near the body. What happened to it?" Prothero's expression darkened. "I dropped it in my haste. By the time I realized the body had been discovered, I couldn't risk returning for it." "And the portrait from the locket?" Miss Marple pressed. "Hidden," Prothero said grimly, "where none of you will ever find it. Without it, the locket is merely an antique trinket, not proof of inheritance." Floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Prothero spun toward the sound, momentarily distracted. In that instant, Lawrence lunged forward, grasping for the revolver. The two men struggled briefly before a deafening shot rang out, echoing through the small room. Lawrence staggered back, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. Prothero raised the weapon again, his face contorted with desperation. "Don't be a fool, Colonel," came a calm voice from the doorway. Eleanor Vane stood there, pale but composed, flanked by Constable Wells and Dr. Haydock. "There's no escape." Prothero's gaze darted between his captives and the newcomers, calculation visible in his eyes. "The portrait isn't hidden at all, is it?" Miss Marple said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. "It's in the lining of your wallet, the one place you knew would never be separated from you." A flicker of surprise crossed the Colonel's face before his expression hardened again. "How could you possibly know that?" he demanded. "You have a habit of patting your breast pocket whenever the locket is mentioned," Miss Marple explained. "Just as Eleanor touched her locket for reassurance, you touch your wallet, where you've hidden the final piece of evidence against you." Inspector Slack saw his opportunity and moved swiftly. With a precise strike to Prothero's wrist, he dislodged the revolver, which clattered to the floor. In seconds, the Colonel was subdued, his protests silenced by the cold metal of handcuffs, closing around his wrists. "Colonel James Prothero," Slack said formally, "I am arresting you for the murder of Cedric Llewellyn and the attempted murder of Lawrence Redding." As the Colonel was led away, Dr. Haydock hurried to attend to Lawrence's wound. "Not serious," he pronounced after a quick examination. "The bullet merely grazed your shoulder." Eleanor rushed to Lawrence's side, relief evident in her face. "You found the portrait," she said, eyeing the miniature that had fallen to the floor during the struggle. "Yes," Lawrence smiled weakly, "though it nearly cost me more than I anticipated." Miss Marple bent to retrieve the small portrait, studying the delicate brushwork with appreciation. "A remarkable likeness of Catherine Carmichael in her youth," she observed, "and the final proof needed to establish your claims." Inspector Slack returned to the room, his official demeanour slightly relaxed. "Prothero has confessed to everything. The embezzlement, the murder, all of it. Says he's tired of running." He turned to Miss Marple with reluctant admiration. "How did you know about the portrait being in his wallet?" "I didn't," Miss Marple admitted with a small smile. "But it seemed the logical place, and his reaction confirmed it. Sometimes, Inspector, the best detection comes from understanding human nature rather than physical evidence.